I woke up that Tuesday morning to find a certified letter taped to my front door. And somehow I knew my life in Prescott, Arizona, was about to become a living nightmare. The envelope had the Sunset Ridge HOA logo printed on it, that ridiculous desert sunset graphic that was supposed to make our neighborhood feel exclusive. I ripped it open while standing on my porch, still in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. The letter was 3 pages long, typed in that aggressive all-caps font that screamed legal threat, informing me that my private well was in violation of community standards and that I had 30 days to cap it permanently and connect to the municipal water supply. My name is Blake Brennan, and I had been living in this house for 8 years. I bought the property specifically because it had a functioning well that dated back to the 1960s, long before this HOA-controlled development had even been dreamed up. The well gave me independence, lower utility bills, and pure, clean water that tasted better than anything that came through treated pipes. More importantly, Arizona state law explicitly protected my right to that well. I stood there reading and rereading the letter, my blood pressure climbing with each pass. The signature at the bottom belonged to Linda Patterson, the HOA president, a woman whose face I could picture perfectly. Tight blonde bob, too much makeup, and a permanent expression like she had just smelled something offensive. She had moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago and immediately gotten herself elected to the board by promising to elevate property values and maintain standards. What she really meant was making everyone's life miserable with petty rules and constant inspections. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Derek, who had dealt with HOA issues in his previous house. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding groggy. "Blake, it's 7 in the morning, man. The HOA is coming after my well. They want me to cap it and hook up to city water." That woke him up. "They can't do that. That's your water right. Arizona protects that." That's what I thought, but they're claiming it violates some architectural standard or community aesthetic bullshit. "I have 30 days. Derek whistled low. "You need a lawyer, brother. Don't try to fight this alone. These HOA people, they're like piranhas once they smell blood in the water." I spent the rest of that morning researching Arizona water law. The statutes were clear. Wells that predated HOA covenants were grandfathered in, and water rights in Arizona were considered property rights, protected at the state constitutional level. The HOA couldn't just strip me of those rights because Linda Patterson decided my wellhead was unsightly. But the letter had mentioned fines. $500 per day if I didn't comply within the 30-day window. That would add up to financial ruin fast. They were betting I would fold rather than fight. I wasn't going to fold. By noon, I had an appointment scheduled with Thomas Reeves, a property rights attorney in Prescott who had good reviews and experience dealing with HOA disputes. His office was downtown, in one of those renovated historic buildings that still had the original wood floors and high ceilings. He was a lean man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Tell me about your well," he said after we shook hands and sat down. I explained the whole situation. The well had been drilled in 1967 by the original property owner, a rancher named Samuel Morrison, who had owned 40 acres before the land was subdivided in the early 2000s. When I bought the house in 2018, the well was listed on the deed as an appurtenant right. I had the documentation, the permits, everything. Thomas listened, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "Arizona Revised Statutes Title 45 is explicit about this. Water rights are real property rights. Your well predates their covenants, conditions, and restrictions by decades. Even if you had signed their CCRs when you bought the house, which I assume you did, they can't override state law. So what do? First, you respond to their letter in writing. We'll cite the relevant statutes and case law. We'll make it clear that you're not complying because they have no legal authority to make this demand. Then we wait to see if they escalate. What if they start fining me? Then we file an injunction and possibly a lawsuit. If they're foolish enough to pursue this, we can make them pay your legal fees under the prevailing party statute. HOAs have to act in good faith and within the law. This is neither. I left his office feeling better but still anxious. Fighting an HOA was expensive, even if I might recover costs later. And Linda Patterson didn't strike me as someone who backed down easily. That evening I got a knock on my door. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. She was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. "I heard about the letter," she said. "I brought you some dinner. You shouldn't have to cook while dealing with this stress." I invited her in, touched by the gesture. Mrs. Chen had been in the neighborhood longer than me. She remembered when there was no HOA at all, back when it was just a handful of houses on large lots. "Linda Patterson is a menace," Mrs. Chen said, settling into my living room couch. "She's been after everyone for something. Last month she tried to fine the Johnsons because their mailbox was the wrong shade of brown. The month before that, she cited 3 families for leaving their trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. Why does anyone tolerate her? Most people are scared. They don't want the hassle, the conflict. They pay the fines and comply because it's easier. But Blake, that's different. That's not a mailbox color. That's your livelihood, your property rights. You have to fight this." She was right. This wasn't about being a good neighbor or maintaining harmony. This was about fundamental rights. Over the next week, Thomas drafted a detailed response letter. It was 6 pages of legal citations, case law, and constitutional arguments. The core message was simple. The HOA had no authority over my well, and any attempt to fine or penalize me would result in immediate legal action. We sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. 3 days later, I got the return receipt confirmation. Linda Patterson had signed for it personally. I allowed myself a moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would see reason and back off. That hope lasted exactly 48 hours. On a Saturday morning, I was working in my garage when I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway. I looked up to see Linda Patterson herself climbing out of a white Mercedes SUV, flanked by 2 other people I recognized from HOA meetings. One was Gerald Morton, the board treasurer, a balding man with glasses who always looked nervous. The other was Patricia Yates, the secretary, a thin woman with a perpetual scowl. "Blake Brennan," Linda called out, her voice dripping with false pleasantness. "We need to have a conversation." I wiped my hands on a rag and walked to meet them, staying calm. "Linda, I got your letter. My attorney sent you a response. I think everything that needs to be said has been said." Her smile vanished. "Your attorney's letter is full of nonsense. We consulted with our HOA counsel, and he assured us that we're well within our rights to enforce community standards. Your well is an eyesore and a liability." I looked past her at the wellhead, which was barely visible from the street. It was a simple pump housing, painted green to blend with the landscaping, no more than 3 feet tall. Calling it an eyesore was absurd. "State law protects my water rights," I said evenly. "This isn't a debate." Patricia stepped forward, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. "You signed the CCRs when you bought this property. That means you agreed to abide by our rules." Section 12. Subsection 4 states that all structures visible from the street must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Your well was never approved. My well was here 40 years before your Architectural Review Committee existed. Grandfathered property rights supersede HOA covenants. This is settled law. Linda's face was turning red. We're not backing down on this, Blake. You're going to comply or you're going to pay. The fines start in 3 weeks. Fine me and I'll sue. You'll lose and you'll pay my legal fees. Is that really how you want to spend the HOA's money? Gerald looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. Linda, maybe we should discuss this further with our attorney before we've already discussed it, Linda snapped, cutting him off. Blake is going to learn that we don't tolerate defiance in this community. Rules exist for a reason. They left in a huff, tires squealing slightly as Linda backed out of my driveway. I stood there, heart pounding, anger and adrenaline coursing through me. This was personal for her now. It wasn't about the well anymore. It was about control, about proving she could bend people to her will. I called Thomas immediately and told him what had happened. Document everything, he advised. Keep records of every interaction, every letter, every conversation. If they show up at your house again, record it if Arizona's a one-party consent state for recording, which it is. The more evidence we have of harassment, the stronger our case becomes. That Sunday, I decided to do some digging into Linda Patterson's background. It wasn't hard to find information in the age of social media and public records. She had moved to Prescott from Scottsdale, where she had been on a different HOA board. A quick search of that HOA's name plus lawsuit brought up several hits. Apparently, she had been involved in multiple disputes there too, including one case where the HOA had been sued for selective enforcement and lost. This was her pattern. She got elected, pushed her weight around, caused conflict, and moved on before the consequences caught up with her. I printed out the articles and case summaries and sent them to Thomas. Might be useful, I wrote in the email. Shows a history of overreach. Monday morning, I had to go to work. I was a project manager for a construction firm, and we had a big commercial job starting that week. I tried to focus on blueprints and schedules, but my mind kept drifting back to the HOA situation. During my lunch break, I got a text from Mrs. Chen. Linda Patterson is at your house with a surveyor. Thought you should know. I called her immediately. What are they doing? Taking measurements, looking at your well. I watched from my window. They were there for about 20 minutes. I felt violated. They had entered my property without permission, without notice. I checked my security camera footage remotely from my phone. Sure enough, Linda and a man with surveying equipment had walked around my yard, taking photos and measurements of the wellhead and pump house. I forwarded the footage to Thomas with a terse message. Trespassing. He called me within minutes. This is good for us, actually. It shows they're escalating inappropriately. I'm going to send them a cease and desist letter today. They need to know that accessing your property without permission is illegal and that we're documenting everything. The cease and desist went out that afternoon. I didn't hear anything back from the HOA for several days, which made me nervous. Silence from Linda Patterson felt more ominous than her threats. The following Saturday, I was finally starting to relax a bit. I spent the morning working on my truck, changing the oil and rotating the tires. It was therapeutic, getting my hands dirty, focusing on something mechanical and straightforward. Around noon, Derek stopped by with beer and sandwiches. How's the HOA war going? He asked, handing me a cold bottle. Quiet this week. Too quiet. Maybe they realize they can't win. Or maybe they're planning something worse. We were sitting on my porch, eating and talking about normal things, work and sports and weekend plans, when a Prescott police cruiser pulled up in front of my house. Two officers got out and walked up my driveway. My stomach dropped. "Can I help you, officers?" The older of the two, a sergeant with gray at his temples, checked his notepad. "Blake Brennan. That's me. We received a complaint about illegal water usage. The complainant alleges you're operating a well without proper permits and potentially contaminating the groundwater supply." I felt my face flush with anger. "That's completely false. My well is fully permitted, has been inspected, and meets all state and county regulations. I have all the documentation inside." The younger officer looked skeptical. "The complaint came from your HOA president. She seemed pretty insistent that this was a public health issue. She's harassing me because I won't cap my well. This is a civil dispute, not a criminal matter." "She's wasting your time." The sergeant sighed, and I could tell he had seen this kind of thing before. "Do you have the permits?" "Absolutely. Give me 2 minutes." I went inside, grabbed the file folder I had prepared with Thomas's help, and brought it out. It contained the original well drilling permit from 1967, the transfer documents when I bought the property, inspection reports from the county health department, and water quality test results from just 6 months ago showing the water was safe and clean. The sergeant reviewed everything carefully while the younger officer stood by. After a few minutes, he handed the folder back. "Everything looks in order, Mr. Brennan. Your well is legal and properly maintained. I'll note that in my report." "Can I ask what happens to someone who files a false complaint?" The sergeant gave me a sympathetic look. "Technically, filing a false police report is a crime, but proving intent is difficult. My advice: document this incident and include it in whatever civil action you're taking. It shows harassment and misuse of public resources." After they left, Derek let out a low whistle. "She called the cops on you. That's insane." "That's Linda Patterson." I immediately called Thomas and told him what had happened. He was furious on my behalf. "This crosses a line. Filing false complaints with law enforcement to harass someone is actionable. We need to accelerate our timeline. I'm going to prepare an injunction request and a lawsuit. We're going to ask for damages, attorney's fees, and a court order preventing the HOA from any further action regarding your well." "How long will that take?" "I can file by the end of next week. We'll request an expedited hearing given the harassment and the threat of fines. With luck, we'll be in front of a judge within a month." The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday. Thomas named the HOA as an entity and Linda Patterson personally as a defendant, citing harassment, abuse of authority, and violation of state water rights statutes. We requested actual damages for my legal fees, punitive damages for the harassment, and injunctive relief. The local newspaper got wind of it. A reporter named Sarah Martinez called me the day after the filing became public record. "Mr. Brennan, I'm doing a story on your lawsuit against the Sunset Ridge HOA. Would you be willing to comment?" I hesitated, then figured the truth couldn't hurt. "The HOA is trying to force me to abandon a well that's been on my property since 1967. They have no legal authority to do so, and when I refused to comply, they started harassing me, trespassing on my property, and filing false police reports. I'm fighting to protect my property rights and to hold the HOA accountable for its abuse of power." "And the HOA president, Linda Patterson?" "Linda Patterson has a history of this behavior. She was involved in multiple lawsuits in Scottsdale before moving here. She seems to view the HOA as her personal fiefdom rather than a community organization." The story ran on Sunday, front page of the local section. It was balanced, including comments from Linda claiming I was a disruptive homeowner who refused to follow community standards. but the facts spoke for themselves. The article included quotes from Thomas about Arizona water law and mentioned Linda's history in Scottsdale. The community reaction was swift. By Monday morning, I had messages from 6 other homeowners in Sunset Ridge, all of whom had their own horror stories about Linda Patterson and the HOA board. One couple had been fined $5,000 for painting their house a shade of beige that was not on the approved color palette. Another homeowner had been cited for having a vegetable garden in his backyard, which Linda claimed attracted pests. A retired veteran had been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines related to his flagpole height. These people were angry, fed up, and suddenly emboldened by my lawsuit. Several of them talked about recalling the board or filing their own legal actions. Thomas suggested organizing a community meeting. If you can show the court that there's a pattern of abuse affecting multiple homeowners, it strengthens your case significantly. Plus, there's safety in numbers. The HOA can't bully everyone. We scheduled the meeting for the following Wednesday evening at the Prescott Community Center. I rented a room, sent out emails to every Sunset Ridge homeowner I could find contact information for, and posted flyers around the neighborhood. Linda Patterson found out, of course. 2 days before the meeting, I received another certified letter, this one threatening me with additional fines for organizing activities that damage the reputation of the community and inciting homeowner rebellion. The letter was so over the top, so obviously desperate that I actually laughed when I read it. Thomas was delighted when I sent him a copy. "She's panicking. This is going to look terrible in front of a judge. Keep it safe. It's evidence." The night of the meeting, I arrived early to set up chairs and a small table with cookies and coffee. I expected maybe a dozen people. By the time we started, there were 47 homeowners packed into that room, many standing because we ran out of chairs. The energy was electric, a mix of anger and relief and solidarity. People who had been suffering in silence for months or years suddenly realized they weren't alone. I stood at the front of the room, nervous but determined. "Thank you all for coming. I'm Blake Brennan, and most of you probably know why we're here. The HOA, specifically Linda Patterson, has been abusing its authority. For me, it's my well. For others, it's fines over paint colors or gardens or mailboxes. We're here to share our stories and figure out how to fight back." One by one, people stood and told their stories. A woman named Jennifer described how Linda had threatened to fine her for having a tire swing in her backyard because it wasn't aesthetically appropriate. A man named Robert explained how the HOA had tried to force him to remove solar panels from his roof, even though they were legally protected under Arizona's solar rights law. An elderly couple, the Williamses, had been cited for having their grandchildren's toys visible in the yard during a weekend visit. The stories went on for over an hour. Some were infuriating, some were heartbreaking. All of them painted a picture of an HOA board that had lost sight of its purpose and become a tool for one person's power trip. Thomas, who had come to observe and offer legal guidance, addressed the group. "What you're describing is a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement. Arizona law requires HOAs to act in good faith and apply rules consistently. What Linda Patterson and this board have been doing is likely actionable. For those of you who want to pursue legal remedies, I'm happy to consult. But there are also non-legal options. You can call for a special election to recall the board. You can organize to elect new members. You can demand transparency and accountability." A younger woman named Amanda raised her hand. "How do we start a recall?" Thomas explained the process. which varied depending on the specific HOA bylaws, but generally required a petition signed by a certain percentage of homeowners and then a vote. Someone volunteered to draft the petition. Others volunteered to collect signatures. Within an hour, we had the framework of a grassroots movement. By the time the meeting ended at 9:30, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. We weren't just fighting Linda Patterson anymore. We were reclaiming our community. The next morning, I woke to find my truck's windshield smashed. Glass was everywhere, covering the driveway and the inside of the cab. There was a note tucked under the wiper blade that had survived. "Drop the lawsuit." I called the police immediately. The same sergeant who had come about the well complaint showed up to take the report. "Any idea who did this?" he asked, photographing the damage. "I have a pretty good guess, but no proof." "The HOA thing?" "Yeah." He frowned, looking at the note, which was printed on plain white paper with no identifying features. "This is escalating from civil dispute into criminal territory. Vandalism, potentially intimidation or threatening. I'll file the report, but without evidence tying it to a specific person, there's not much we can do right now. What if it happens again? Install more cameras. Document everything. If there's a pattern, we can investigate further. And Mr. Brennan, be careful. People who do this kind of thing, they're not thinking rationally." I called Thomas and told him about the vandalism. He was concerned but not surprised. "This actually helps our case in a perverse way. It shows the level of animosity and harassment you're facing. Make sure the police report gets included in our court filings. We're going to request the hearing be moved up based on escalating threats." The repair shop quoted me $1,200 for a new windshield and interior cleaning. I paid it and added the receipt to my growing file of HOA-related expenses. 2 days later, the recall petition was ready. Amanda and a team of volunteers started going door to door collecting signatures. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, they had signatures from 60% of the homeowners, well above the threshold needed to trigger a recall election. Linda Patterson fought back. She sent out a mass email to all homeowners, claiming the recall was being organized by a small group of malcontents who want to turn our beautiful community into a lawless mess. She accused me by name of manipulating people and spreading lies. The email backfired spectacularly. 3 homeowners who hadn't signed the petition before sought out Amanda specifically to add their names, telling her that Linda's email was condescending and insulting. The recall election was scheduled for 3 weeks out, to be held at the same community center where we had our meeting. The HOA bylaws required it to be conducted by an independent third party, so we hired a local election services company to manage the ballots and counting. Meanwhile, my court date was approaching. Thomas had successfully argued for an expedited hearing, and we were set to appear before Judge Harold Martinez in Yavapai County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning. The weekend before the hearing, I spent hours preparing with Thomas, going over my testimony, reviewing documents, and anticipating the HOA's arguments. Their attorney, a slick guy named Richard Fowler from a Phoenix firm that specialized in HOA representation, had filed a response that essentially argued the HOA had broad authority to regulate property use and that my well violated aesthetic standards. "It's a weak argument," Thomas assured me. "They're trying to claim aesthetic regulation can override state water law. No judge is going to buy that. But be prepared for them to attack your credibility, to paint you as a troublemaker." Court day arrived cold and clear. I wore a suit, something I almost never did, and met Thomas at the courthouse at 8:30. The hallways were busy with lawyers and plaintiffs and defendants, all waiting for their cases to be called. Linda Patterson was there with Richard Fowler, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than my truck repair. She glared at me across the hallway but didn't approach. At 9, we were called into Judge Martinez's courtroom. It was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with the state and national flags flanking the judge's bench. Judge Martinez was a Hispanic man in his 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. He had read the briefs, and he got straight to business. This case concerns a property owner's water rights versus HOA covenant enforcement. Mr. Reeves, you represent the plaintiff. Make your argument. Thomas stood, calm and confident. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. My client owns a well that was legally drilled in 1967, decades before the HOA existed. Arizona water law explicitly protects such wells as property rights that cannot be abridged by private covenants. The HOA's attempt to force Mr. Brennan to cap his well violates state statute and constitutional protections. Furthermore, when Mr. Brennan refused to comply with their illegal demand, the HOA engaged in a pattern of harassment, including trespassing, filing false police reports, and threatening ruinous fines. We're asking this court to issue an injunction preventing any HOA action against the well, to award damages for the harassment, and to set a precedent that HOAs cannot override state water law. Richard Fowler stood for the defense. Your Honor, the HOA has a legitimate interest in maintaining community standards. Mr. Brennan signed the CCRs when he purchased his property, agreeing to abide by all rules and regulations. The Architectural Review Committee has authority over all visible structures, including wells. This isn't about water rights. It's about a homeowner who wants to ignore the rules everyone else follows. Judge Martinez looked skeptical. Counselor, are you arguing that an HOA can prohibit a legal well that predates the HOA's existence? We're arguing that aesthetic regulations are within the HOA's purview, Your Honor. Even when they conflict with state water law, Fowler hesitated. The CCRs give the HOA broad authority. Not broader than state statute, they don't. Mr. Reeves, do you have the well documentation? Thomas presented the permits, the deed records, and the water quality reports. Judge Martinez reviewed them carefully, occasionally asking questions about dates and regulations. He also looked at the photos of the well, which showed how unobtrusive it was. Then Thomas introduced the evidence of harassment. The HOA letters, the police reports from the false complaint, the documentation of the trespassing incident, and photos of my vandalized truck. Your Honor, this goes beyond a simple covenant dispute. The HOA president has waged a personal vendetta against my client for asserting his legal rights. We have testimony from other homeowners about similar patterns of abuse. Judge Martinez turned to Fowler. Does your client have any evidence that this well presents a legitimate health or safety concern, or that it genuinely impacts property values? We have the HOA president's testimony about community standards. That's not evidence, Counselor. That's an opinion. Do you have any studies, appraisals, or expert testimony? No, Your Honor. The judge sat back looking annoyed. Here's my ruling. Arizona water law is clear and controlling. Wells that predate HOA covenants are protected property rights. The Sunset Ridge HOA has no authority to force Mr. Brennan to cap his well or to fine him for maintaining it. I'm granting the injunction. The HOA is permanently barred from any action related to Mr. Brennan's well. Furthermore, given the evidence of harassment, I'm awarding Mr. Brennan damages in the amount of his legal fees to date, plus $5,000 in punitive damages for the harassment. The HOA will pay these amounts within 30 days. If there are further retaliatory actions, Mr. Brennan is authorized to return to this court for additional relief, including potential criminal contempt charges against the HOA board members personally. I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed out loud. Thomas squeezed my shoulder, and I saw Linda Patterson's face go pale. Judge Martinez wasn't done. "Miss Patterson, I understand you're the HOA president. Let me be very clear. HOAs exist to serve their communities, not to harass homeowners who exercise their legal rights. If I see you in my courtroom again for this kind of abuse, I will not be lenient. Do you understand?" Linda stood stiff and furious. "Yes, Your Honor. Good. This court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, I shook Thomas's hand, feeling like a weight had been lifted off my chest. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you. You stood up for yourself when most people would have caved. That takes courage. And Blake, you've probably helped a lot of other people in your community by setting this precedent." The local newspaper ran a story about the ruling that afternoon. The headline was "Judge Sides with Homeowner in HOA Water Rights Dispute, Awards Damages for Harassment." The article included quotes from the hearing and mentioned the upcoming recall election. The election was 5 days away. In the aftermath of the court ruling, momentum shifted dramatically. Even homeowners who had been on the fence about the recall were now firmly in favor of removing Linda Patterson and the board. On Election Day, turnout was unprecedented for an HOA vote. Nearly 80% of homeowners cast ballots. I volunteered at the polling location, greeting neighbors and answering questions. The mood was celebratory, almost festive, like people were taking back something that had been stolen from them. The results were announced that evening. The recall passed with 73% in favor. Linda Patterson, Gerald Morton, and Patricia Yates were removed from the board immediately. A new interim board was elected on the spot, with Amanda voted in as president. Linda didn't show up to the meeting. Rumor had it she was already planning to move, unable to face the community she had alienated. The new board's first action was to rescind all pending fines that had been issued under Linda's tenure, and to establish a review process for past fines. They also voted to reimburse me directly for the court-ordered damages, rather than forcing me to chase payment. Amanda approached me after the meeting. "Blake, I want to thank you. If you hadn't stood up and fought, none of this would have happened. We'd all still be living under her thumb. I just didn't want to lose my well, but I'm glad it helped." "It did more than help. You showed us we didn't have to be victims." Over the following weeks, life in Sunset Ridge slowly returned to normal, or rather, to a new and better normal. The new board focused on actual community improvement, organizing neighborhood events, maintaining common areas, and enforcing rules fairly and reasonably. I received the check for my damages and legal fees. It felt good to be made whole, though no amount of money could compensate for the stress and anxiety of those months. One evening in early May, I was sitting on my porch, drinking iced tea drawn from my well water, when Mrs. Chen walked over with a homemade pie. "Thought you might like some dessert," she said with a warm smile. "You're going to spoil me, Mrs. Chen. You deserve it. You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 18 years. The last 2 with Linda Patterson were the worst. Now it feels like a community again." We sat together, watching the sun set over the Arizona hills, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. My well was safe. The HOA was accountable. The neighborhood was healing. A week later, I got a call from Sarah Martinez, the newspaper reporter. "Blake, I'm doing a follow-up story on HOA reform efforts statewide. Your case has inspired legislation. State Representative Kevin Walsh is introducing a bill to strengthen protections for homeowners against HOA overreach. He's specifically citing your water rights case as an example of why reform is needed. Would you be willing to testify at the State House if the bill goes to committee? I thought about it for about 2 seconds. Absolutely. The bill, formally titled the Homeowner Protection Act, was introduced in June. It included provisions requiring HOAs to exhaust mediation before issuing fines, prohibiting retaliation against homeowners who exercised legal rights, and clarifying that HOAs could not override state law on issues like water rights and solar energy. In July, I drove down to Phoenix to testify before the House Committee on Regulatory Affairs. The committee room was packed with homeowners who had their own horror stories, along with lobbyists from HOA management companies arguing against the bill. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story simply and honestly. I explained how the HOA had tried to strip me of my legal water rights, how they had harassed me when I refused to comply, and how only a costly legal battle had protected my property. I emphasized that most homeowners couldn't afford to fight the way I had, and that the power imbalance between HOAs and individual owners was fundamentally unfair. The committee members asked thoughtful questions, and several expressed frustration with HOA abuses they had heard about from constituents. After 2 hours of testimony, the committee voted to advance the bill. It passed the full House in August and the Senate in September. The governor signed it in October. Arizona became one of the first states in the country with comprehensive HOA reform legislation, and my well dispute was part of the catalyst. Back in Prescott, life continued to improve. The new HOA board under Amanda's leadership proved competent and fair. They revised the CCRs to remove some of the more ridiculous restrictions Linda had added, like the prohibition on backyard gardens and the overly restrictive paint color palette. Derek and I were working on my truck one Saturday when he brought up the whole ordeal. You ever regret fighting it? I mean, it cost you months of stress and a lot of money up front. I thought about the question seriously. No, if I had given in, I would have lost something fundamental, not just the well, but my sense of control over my own property, my own life. And honestly, knowing that what I went through helped other people, helped change the law, that makes it worth it. You're a better man than me. I probably would have caved. I don't think you would have. When it matters, people surprise themselves. In November, I got a letter from a law firm in Scottsdale. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a thank you. A group of homeowners in Linda Patterson's old neighborhood had successfully sued their HOA for past abuses, citing my case as precedent. They wanted me to know that my fight had helped them win theirs. I kept that letter. It reminded me that standing up to bullies, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, can have ripples far beyond your own situation. Christmas came, and the new HOA board organized a neighborhood party in the common area. There was a potluck, lights strung up in the trees, and kids running around in the warm Arizona evening. It felt like a real community, people who actually liked each other and wanted to be there. Amanda made a short speech, thanking everyone for participating in the recall and the reforms. She specifically mentioned me, which made me uncomfortable, but the applause was genuine and warm. Later, as I was helping clean up, a young couple approached me. They had just bought a house in the neighborhood the month before. "We heard about what you did," the husband said. "Fighting the HOA, protecting your rights. That's actually why we felt comfortable buying here. We knew the HOA had been reformed, that it wasn't going to be a nightmare." His wife nodded. "We looked at other neighborhoods, but the HOA horror stories scared us off. When we found out about Sunset Ridge and what had changed, it felt safe. That conversation stayed with me. My fight hadn't just protected my well. It had helped make the neighborhood attractive to new families, had preserved property values in a real way, not the fake way Linda had always harped about. In January, almost exactly a year after I had found that first certified letter on my door, I was contacted by a producer from a Phoenix television station. They were doing a segment on HOA reform and the new state law, and they wanted to interview me. I agreed, and they came out to Prescott with a camera crew. They filmed me at my house, showing the well, talking about the dispute, and explaining why water rights mattered in Arizona. They interviewed Thomas Reeves, Amanda from the HOA board, and even got a brief comment from Judge Martinez about the importance of HOAs operating within the law. The segment aired on a Friday evening. I watched it at home with Derek, Mrs. Chen, and a few other neighbors who had become close friends through the whole ordeal. It was strange seeing myself on television, but the story was told fairly and powerfully. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Other homeowners from across Arizona, even from other states, wanted advice on fighting their own HOA battles. I did my best to help, referring people to Thomas and to other property rights attorneys, sharing the strategies that had worked for me. By spring, my life had fully returned to normal, though I was changed by the experience. I was more engaged in community affairs, more willing to speak up when I saw injustice. I had learned that institutions, even small ones like HOAs, could become corrupt when good people stayed silent, and that individual action really could make a difference. The well continued to provide pure, clean water. Every time I filled a glass from my tap, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. This was my water from my land, protected by my rights. No HOA president, no matter how determined or vindictive, could take that away. In April, I got one final piece of correspondence related to the whole affair. It was a notification that Linda Patterson had sold her house and moved out of state. Apparently, she couldn't handle living in a neighborhood where everyone knew her as the HOA tyrant who had lost so spectacularly. I felt a small pang of something, not quite sympathy, but an acknowledgement of how badly she had miscalculated. If she had just left my well alone, if she had focused on actual community improvement instead of petty power trips, she could still be living in Sunset Ridge, respected instead of reviled. But she had made her choices, and choices have consequences. Derek hosted a barbecue at his place to celebrate the unofficial end of the HOA saga. It was a perfect Arizona evening, warm but not hot, with a breeze carrying the scent of mesquite smoke and grilled meat. 20 or so neighbors showed up, eating and drinking and laughing together. At one point, Robert, the guy who had fought for his solar panels, raised his beer bottle in a toast to Blake for having the guts to fight when the rest of us were too scared. Everyone joined in, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and pride. I wasn't brave, I said. I was just stubborn, and lucky to have good people backing me up. Stubborn works, Amanda said with a grin. Sometimes that's all it takes. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, I found myself standing alone by Derek's pool, looking up at the stars. Arizona had incredible night skies when you got away from city lights, and even here in suburban Prescott, the Milky Way was visible. I thought about the past year, about the stress and the fear and the anger, but also about the victories and the friendships and the changes for the better. If someone had told me a year ago that an HOA dispute would lead to state legislation and a complete reform of my neighborhood, I would have laughed. But life is unpredictable. Small stands can become big movements. Individual voices can echo into choruses. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Thomas Reeves. Saw the news piece. You did good, Blake. Proud to have represented you. I texted back. Couldn't have done it without you. Thanks for everything. Walking home that night, past houses where lights glowed warm in windows and families gathered for evening routines, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was my neighborhood, my community, my home. And that well in my yard, that simple thing that had caused so much conflict, was just water drawn from deep earth, pure and cold and entirely mine. The next morning, I woke to my alarm and got ready for work like any normal Monday. But as I grabbed my travel mug and filled it with water from the tap, well water that tasted clean and slightly sweet, I paused and smiled. Some battles are worth fighting. Some rights are worth defending. And sometimes, being stubborn enough to stand your ground can change everything. I locked my front door, climbed into my truck with its new windshield, and drove to work thinking about all the other people out there dealing with HOA overreach, with petty tyrants who had forgotten that power comes with responsibility. I hoped my story gave them courage. I hoped they would fight too, because in the end, that's how things change. Not through grand gestures or powerful institutions, but through regular people deciding they've had enough, that they're not going to be pushed around anymore, that their rights matter. My well was safe. My community was healed. And somewhere in Arizona, maybe across the country, other homeowners were learning they had rights too, protections they could invoke, legal tools they could use to fight back against abuse. That was Linda Patterson's real legacy, though she never intended it. In trying to break one homeowner's will, she had awakened an entire community. In pushing too hard, she had triggered reforms that would protect thousands of others. I thought about sending her a thank you card, just to be ironic, but decided against it. She didn't need any more attention, and I had moved on. Life was good. The sun was shining. My truck ran smooth. And deep beneath my property, water flowed through rock and soil, pure and protected, waiting whenever I needed it. That was enough. That was everything.